Hello students! In this video, we will learn about antonyms. A-N-T-O-N-Y-M-S. Antonyms. Now, you must be thinking, what are antonyms? Words that are opposite in meaning are called antonyms. In Hindi, we call it विलोम शब्द. विलोम शब्द का अर्थ है उल्टा या विपरीत. अतः किसी शब्द का उल्टा अर्थ. Now let's see some examples. Lost, found. The opposite of lost is found. Lie, truth. The opposite of lie is truth. Kind, cruel. The opposite of kind is cruel. Last, first. The opposite of last is first. Individual, group. The opposite of individual is group. Near, far. The opposite of near is far. Peace, war. The opposite of peace is war. Same, different. The opposite of same is different. Polite, rude. The opposite of polite is rude. Rare, common. The opposite of rare is common. Fat, slim. The opposite of fat is slim. Black, white. The opposite of black is white. Below, above. The opposite of below is above. Artificial, natural. The opposite of artificial is natural. Bore, amuse. The opposite of bore is amuse. Birth, death. The opposite of birth is death. Better, worse. The opposite of better is worse. Borrow, lend. The opposite of borrow is lend. body, soul. The opposite of body is soul. Floor, ceiling. The opposite of floor is ceiling. Bitter, sweet. The opposite of bitter is sweet. Beginning, end. The opposite of beginning is end. Hate, love. The opposite of hate is love. Temporary, permanent. The opposite of temporary is permanent. Pain, pleasure. The opposite of pain is pleasure. Laugh, cry. The opposite of laugh is cry. Innocent, guilty. The opposite of innocent is guilty. Immoral, moral. The opposite of immoral is moral. Unite, divide. The opposite of unite is divide. Fear, courage. The opposite of fear is courage. Reduce, increase. The opposite of reduce is increase. Shallow, deep. The opposite of shallow is deep. King, queen. The opposite of king is queen. Beg, offer. The opposite of beg is offer. Import, export. The opposite of import is export. Hide, show. The opposite of hide is show. Boy, girl. The opposite of boy is girl. Sun, moon. The opposite of sun is moon. Strong, weak. The opposite of strong is weak. Summer, winter. The opposite of summer is winter. break, fix. The opposite of break is fix. Accurate, incorrect. The opposite of accurate is incorrect. Imaginary, real. The opposite of imaginary is real. Imprison, free. The opposite of imprison is free. Stay, go. The opposite of stay is go. In, out. The opposite of in is out. Kind, mean. The opposite of kind is mean. Sweet, sour. The opposite of sweet is sour. All, none. The opposite of all is none. Antique, modern. The opposite of antique is modern. Buy, sell. The opposite of buy is sell. Hungry, full. The opposite of hungry is full. Bad, good. The opposite of bad is good. Serious, silly. The opposite of serious is silly. So children, I hope you understood the concept of antonyms.